What is up, everybody, and welcome to FLW Videos. In today's episode, we will be doing something a little bit different than what we normally do on the channel. Today, we will be focused a little bit more on a discussion slash a rant, specifically talking about why I do not think that the nerf should be occurring in Pokemon Go. And for those of you who are not aware of what I'm talking about, anytime a Pokemon is predetermined to be above 4,000 CP, Niantic applies a 9% nerf to its stats. The overall thought is that it's going to provide a balance, but I'm going to explain today why I don't think that is actually the case, and then especially since we have seen some updates to the CP formula, and then we've also seen some things like PvP being added in. I think that this really does need to be addressed sooner rather than later. But yeah, we're gonna go ahead and get into the video. I definitely wanna know what you think about it in the comments section below, especially after you watch some of the video. And if you do enjoy topics like this, definitely make sure to like and subscribe. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the video. So first things first, what Pokemon are typically penalized by this nerf? Although the 4,000 CP threshold is not limited to a specific type of Pokemon, for example, there are a couple of non-legendaries like Slacking, right? But for the most part, the most Pokemon affected are legendary Pokemon. You have a Pokemon like Mewtwo, for example. If you didn't know this, its initial attack stat, or what it should be before a nerf, is actually 330. Yet once it gets that 9% nerf, it gets bumped down to a flat rate of 300 on its attack stat, and it definitely gets hit significantly, right? Yet another Pokemon that could be in the exact same category, a non-legendary Pokemon, if it's below that 4,000 CP, maybe if it is theoretically at 3,999 CP, it will not be nerfed, closing the gap. Like I said before, the initial thought behind this is it's meant to provide multiple options. It's supposed to keep it away from just one specific Pokemon being the king of kings, but I don't think that that is actually the case. I want to go ahead and showcase a couple of examples for you, a couple of classic examples, so let's go ahead and take a look. So for example, we're going to pull up a Pokemon like Garchomp and Groudon. So for Garchomp, it's not going to receive a nerf, yet for Groudon, it's going to receive a nerf, and if you take a look at some of the stats, you're going to run into a couple situations where the overall kind of distance between them is tightened up significantly. But if you were to look at the pre-nerf stats, I mean, Groudon's final attack stat should have been 297, and that is clearly going to outpace that 261 for Garchomp. Secondarily, you have a Pokemon like Rayquaza and Salamence. Check this out, 312 versus 277, but because Rayquaza ends up getting the nerf, you're stuck with a 277 versus a 284. That is massive. That is definitely closing the gap. Now, why is that an issue? Well, if you look at it from just an on-paper standpoint and you say, hey, if you catch yourself a Salamence at level 20, if you catch a Rayquaza at level 20, it's going to cost the same amount of Stardust and it's going to cost the same amount of candy for you to get it up to level 40. And hey, I can obviously not argue that, but what I can argue is that it is much more difficult to get the resources for a legendary Pokemon specifically related to the candy. You're having to go out and do raids, you're having to pay for raids to be able to get yourself the candy for that Pokemon, and that's only if it is actually in as a raid boss, but as you know, they tend to cycle them in and out, so what you're left with is having to get a bunch of rare candy and then dedicating it to a specific Pokemon, meaning you're spending money, you're spending time, you're spending resources to be able to get it, which is much more difficult than a non-legendary Pokemon that you can catch in the wild weather boosted at level 35, and then when the performance really isn't that big of a difference, you're stuck asking yourself the question, should I power up a legendary Pokemon? And yes, I have talked about this in the past, but I think that this nerf is actually the answer to solving the problem of why legendary Pokemon are not really worth it to power up currently in Pokemon Go. If we were to remove the nerf, all of a sudden these legendary Pokemon would, in a way, have the shackles removed from them and their performance would move up immediately. And if you want to argue that there is a balance issue, I would say that that is okay for there to be a discrepancy in the overall performance of legendary versus non-legendary, because In the current way of you receiving the resources for a legendary Pokemon, it is way more expensive than a non-legendary Pokemon. Just imagine this just in the real world. If you have an option that's way more expensive, you would expect a higher performance, you would expect a higher value. You would expect all of these things because you're paying more for it. For example, you are paying more for a legendary Pokemon, but because of the nerfs being applied to them, you're really not getting that extra performance. They're really in shackles, not able to perform as well. I personally think that it would make sense to go ahead and just release the nerf, get rid of it completely. Maybe when we get further into the game and we're talking about Mega Evolution Pokemon, Origin Pokemon, we've already seen Giratina Origin form, for example, but when we start seeing those types of Pokemon, maybe then you apply the nerfs just because their CP goes absolutely crazy off of those variations. But just the base legendary forms, I think they should be left alone. It blows my mind that this nerf is still in effect. It's been there pretty much the whole time. And then now moving forward, so many changes have occurred. You're gonna run into so many weird situations trying to revert it. I'm worried that they're just never gonna undo it. For example, if you have a Pokemon in the Great League and its CP is at 1498, let's say a Vigoroth, for example. Well, because Slacking already got its nerf, if it were to get unnerfed, that would mean its CP would go up and you'd be above 1500 CP, rendering it useless since we can't scale our CPs downward, at least now. I think that there's going to be some problems in changing this, but I just don't think it ever made sense in the first place. But regardless of that, hopefully I kind of made sense with what I was talking about. I definitely want to know what you think about it in the comment section below. Should there be a nerf? Should there not be a nerf? What are your thoughts on this? Definitely let me know in the comments section below, and I will see you next time. I wanted to extend a huge thank you to the supporters over at Patreon. You definitely make this possible, and I 100% appreciate this support. If you are interested in supporting my channel on Patreon, definitely feel free to check out the link in the description.